A pastor was once approached by a stranger who indicated he wanted to make a donation to the church. The stranger explained he had recently come into some money and he wanted to do something for the advancement of the kingdom. So he asked the pastor what the pastor might do with a little bit of extra money. And the pastor thought about it for a moment and said, I have a leaky toilet in the bathroom and I'd like to replace the faucet in there as well. So the stranger asked what kind of money it might take to do this sort of endeavor. The pastor said, well, $100 really ought to get the job done well if you're willing to make that kind of donation. So the stranger abruptly pulled his checkbook out and he wrote the church a check for $100. He gave it to the pastor and he went on his way. The reality is that man had been gifted and blessed with millions of dollars, and he was fully prepared to give it to the pastors who were willing to ask for the advancement of the kingdom. Now, I don't know how true that story is or not, but the point is still the same. It illustrates this idea that we sometimes are very timid to ask God boldly. We read James 4:2 that says, you do not have because you don't ask, and then we ask for very, very small things. That pastor assumed very little of the stranger, and he got very little in return. We, on the other hand, have a God who does big and bold things. And it seems as if he wants to do these bigger and bolder things through impossible and unlikely circumstances, through even less likely people. Think about Joseph, who's in slavery and then ends up in prison, and then somehow, miraculously, through God's providence, rises to be the second in command of Egypt. And then Moses, who's called to bring the people out of Egypt, is able to witness an amazing, miraculous series of events that is big, bold, crazy. You think about Esther, who asks all these people to fast and pray because she's going to go before the king in a way that's not socially acceptable and could cost her her life, to ask for the impossible. You think of Nehemiah, who, same sort of situation, goes before the king to ask for some time off. He wants to go back to Jerusalem, 500 miles away. He wants to be a part of rebuilding it, and he asks the king to finance the project. And God does all these things through all of these unlikely people, and we see it with just character after character after character after character. God does bold and big things through unlikely people because it brings God more glory. It just seems next to impossible, and yet it's how he operates. At the same time, though, we come before God almost timid and almost afraid to ask for big things. It's not to say that God will always do those big things, but we should be asking boldly because we should be expecting and rejoicing in the idea that God wants to do big things and very easily can do big things. In fact, we should have confidence to ask. Hebrews 4:16 says, let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in a time of need. Hebrews 10:19 through 22 says almost the same thing. It's because of Christ that we can go before this fantastic throne room and ask God for the impossible. So the question really is, are you asking? Are you asking boldly? A friend of mine, a former professor, and now he's a pastor in Las Vegas, Dave Earley, said, this is not a theologically correct illustration, and he pointed that out. It's not incorrect, but it's not exactly how it works. But he says, I imagine that God has this huge warehouse just in heaven, and it's just full of all these blessings on every rack, really high, really deep, huge warehouse, and each one of those racks has a name on it. There's Dave Earley, there's Brian Catherman, there's Nehemiah, there's you. And he says, boy, I'd sure hate to get to heaven and look over and see my rack with a whole bunch of blessings that God was just ready to pour out and bestow on me because he didn't ask. He said, I'd sure like to get to the end. I'd like to use all those up in the time that I have. Now again, that's not exactly how God works, but the idea is still there. We should just be asking. We should be asking boldly. We should be hoping that God will do the miraculous around us for his glory. So really, are you asking boldly? That's the question. Are you asking with confidence? Are you expecting to see the miraculous? Don't be disappointed if you don't. But by all means, have the excitement to go before a wonderful Father in heaven and say, this seems impossible, but you can do it. Are your prayers bold?